So I thought, wow, this is a really interesting story about a whole different way of thinking about sovereignty in relation to viruses. And this is a story that kind of has to be told because it's of interest to people studying global health, people interested in science and technology studies, because it's also all about viruses and laboratories and samples and knowledge practices. And also, of course, because it was coming from the global south, about coloniality, post-coloniality, and so forth.
You've just heard Professor Stefan Elbe, our second guest at IPS Behind the Research, a space where we explore what goes into the process of publishing an academic article at International Political Sociology, a journal of the International Studies Association. We see how authors go from idea to finished product. Stefan Elbe is a professor of international relations at the University of Sussex. His expertise includes global health, biosecurity, pandemics, and the international politics of disease. He gleefully shared about the trials and tribulations of collaborative work, as well as the pervasiveness of global inequalities in scientific research. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Professor Stefan Elbe. So obviously you've been working on this for 2 decades now, at least. What made this particular topic interesting to you?
So whilst I was doing my research on the international politics of health and global health security, I came across a notion or a phrase that I'd never really heard about before, and I thought was quite an intriguing notion, but also one that I didn't really understand at all. And this was the notion of viral sovereignty. So viral sovereignty. And of course, as a scholar of international relations, I felt I knew a lot about sovereignty. A lot of kind of core theories of international relations base their theories on the notion of state sovereignty. So that bit was clear. But I had never heard anybody really think about sovereignty in conjunction with viruses. And so this whole notion of viral sovereignty really kind of piqued my interest. And then, on top of this idea was being put forward not by a creative theorist of international relations, somebody working on biopolitics, but this was being put forward by a state minister representing the government of Indonesia. So I had to find out, what does viral sovereignty mean, and why is this being asserted? And the more I looked into this, I realized there's actually a really important and I think also quite interesting story behind this. And in a nutshell, if you go back to a couple of years ago, so pre-COVID-19, everybody was very much concerned about the prospect of a new flu pandemic sweeping around the world. So in the previous century, in the 20th century, there were 3 such flu pandemics. They come along every couple of decades. And so a couple of years ago, there were new viruses called H5N1 flu viruses or bird flu viruses infecting people in Asia. And it was quite a dangerous virus. So the mortality rate for the people who became infected with H5N1 was close to 50%. So one in 2 people would die as a result of the infection. And so the whole world went into kind of pandemic preparedness mode. This could be the beginning of the kind of first major flu pandemic of the 21st century. And all the countries are starting to stockpile medicines. Everybody wants to develop vaccines against this new virus. But it turns out that in order to develop these vaccines to protect your populations, you actually need access to samples of the H5N1 virus. And the country at the time that had the most samples, because they had the most cases of human infection, was Indonesia. Traditionally, countries like Indonesia were accustomed to simply share such kind of biological specimens with other countries around the world and to ship them to much more specialist labs in high-income countries. What happened this time around was very different. So all of a sudden, in the midst of a situation where everybody is desperate to get access to these virus samples, the Indonesian health minister gets up and starts to say, we are proclaiming the notion of viral sovereignty. And this means 3 things. It means 1, that all the virus samples circulating within Indonesia belong to the Indonesian state. Secondly, it's a sovereign decision for Indonesia as to whether we will share these virus samples with the rest of the world. And thirdly, and this really sent shivers around the world, they announced that the Indonesian government had decided not to share H5N1 virus samples with the rest of the community. This caused immediately widespread consternation and panic because, of course, everybody else was thinking, well, how are we going to develop our vaccines to protect our populations if we don't have access to these samples? So the Indonesian minister got a lot of criticism for this decision, for this assertion of viral sovereignty. But at the same time, the Indonesian health minister also got a lot of support because she was arguing that the problem with all of this is that usually the vaccines go predominantly to high-income countries, and there are no medicines to go around and not enough medicines, and usually low and middle-income countries in the global south are last in line. And so therefore they said, we are going to put a marker down to say that we are not going to continue this kind of cooperation unless there's greater equity in terms of access to medicines. And so I thought, wow, this is a really interesting story about a whole different way of thinking about sovereignty in relation to viruses. And this is a story that kind of has to be told because it's of interest to people studying global health, people interested in science and technology studies, because it's also all about viruses and laboratories and samples and knowledge practices. And also, of course, because it was coming from the global south, about coloniality, post-coloniality, and so forth. And so that's that kind of notion of viral sovereignty, which I'd never heard before, was the inspiration for the article of, who owns a deadly virus.
Now that you have this idea in mind, what's your first step? What's the first thing you do? Are you working from a skeleton that you're just gonna put meat on, or you let the materials guide you? How did that go?
The first step was actually not to write an article, because what I really thought is, there wasn't widespread appreciation in international politics around these virus samples. And, people didn't have the understanding of the life sciences and molecular biology. And, when I studied international relations many years ago, we didn't even do health. It wasn't even part of the core curriculum, So I was like, we have to get more to capture what's going on here. And so my first inclination was actually to try to put together an international team of researchers to do a kind of quite a big research project. So I reached out to colleagues at Sussex, at Georgetown University, at the University of Ghana in Accra, to bring our kind of collective knowledge together and to explore, well, how do these virus samples that everybody needs actually move around the world, and what are the value chains as it moves from one place to another? How does all that work? And what are the legal issues here? Do these viruses really belong to countries, or is it like a common good? The different ways of understanding the law. So first move was actually to put a grant proposal together. And that was a lot of work. You're coordinating different teams, you have to cost everything, you plan exactly what you're going to do. So it was a lot of work. And then, as happens so often, and bearing in mind this was before COVID, we didn't get the grant. And so you feel like, all this kind of work was in vain, and it's easy to give up. And for various reasons, we couldn't resubmit to another funder. And so I was like, okay, we didn't get the grant, but the story has to be told somehow. And so I said, okay, by the time you've done a major grant application, you've done so much kind of exploratory research that I felt, we kind of had enough to turn this into an article. So an article was kind of my second idea, but that then also required a lot of requirements of an article are a bit different in terms of the intellectual and theoretical and conceptual dimension. So there was a lot of, how do you begin to think through international relations from the perspective of a virus? IR traditionally, big things, states, international institutions, global political economy. But now we want to turn it methodologically on its head and say, how does all this look like when you start looking through the perspective of something that's so small that it's not even perceptible to the human eye? And so, methodological work to develop the notion of a virography and to think about also how do we capture theoretically all these complicated and interlinked injustices that surround the way in which the world reacts to new infectious disease outbreaks.
Was travel involved in this collection?
So the idea initially was to do quite a bit of travel. And so that was the idea of the grant application.
Yeah.
But then, because A, we didn't get the grant, and then B, COVID happened. And so, of course, during COVID, you couldn't travel. There were travel restrictions, there was social distancing, it wouldn't be safe to do face-to-face interviews. And so it was just it was not possible to travel. But, I had, through various research projects, I had a lot of data, I had a lot of material already. I had in the past been able to interview the Indonesian health minister, and therefore, get her insights as well. She actually wrote a book about all of her experience as well that I had a copy of. And so I felt there was a lot of data there. So initially, I was like, oh, I'm so disappointed because we didn't get the grant to go out and get the data. And then even if we had gotten the grant, it would have actually been very difficult. So we couldn't go out and get the data in the traditional sense, but because COVID was happening and this story of how low and middle income countries get marginalized in the international response was happening in real time as I was writing, it was kind of, the data was coming to me in a sense. You just had to, listen to the news and look around, and the data was all around you because we ended up being in the middle of a major pandemic.
And of this data that comes to you, did any of it surprise you in any way?
Yes. So I think there were two surprises. One was how multifaceted the injustices were. So you would think, yeah, no, everybody's going to cooperate, and we're going to get new vaccines and new benefits from all this knowledge, and everybody benefits. But it was clear that once you listen to voices in the global South, that was not at all the case. And it starts at a very high level. Just, there are not enough vaccines to go around. High income countries can't afford them. They can't benefit commercially from the kind of business activities around developing vaccines, but also, often they're not even entrusted to hold virus samples because they're dangerous pathogens, and they're quite extractivist experiences that they shared, about how scientists from high income countries kind of parachute in. They just want the samples, but they don't really prioritize the research priorities that are there locally on the ground. There were stories of how the people who had gotten the samples and shared the samples weren't even acknowledged in authorship arrangements, or when papers, when you describe a new virus, it's a big academic moment, and people have told stories about how they weren't even mentioned in conference presentations, and it seemed very unfair and very unjust on multiple levels. And so the extent of that was quite surprising. But equally surprising, I think, was the kind of the ingenuity of the Indonesian health minister. She was sat there in the midst of bird flu, thinking, she has a population of over 240 million to protect. She realized that, there wouldn't be enough flu vaccines to go around. What do you do as the health minister of a country that's not going to get access to medicines if there's a pandemic? And so, who would have thought that you would find resistance potential in viruses? She managed with some success to kind of convert virus samples into diplomatic bargaining chips to push for greater equity when it comes to access to medicines in a pandemic situation. And so I thought that was quite remarkable to come up with that resistance strategy.
Something that struck me a lot with your article was actually the amount of layers you integrated into the analysis. Is there something that was left out of this? Or are you fairly satisfied with what you were left with theoretically?
I feel I tried to capture as much as possible. And I felt that the kind of intersectional methodologies were really helpful to bring those layers to kind of together and show how that's not just a conceptual thing, but how all these inequalities actually come together to produce this, what in the article I call a name vital abandonment, where the bare life of populations is literally exposed to the kind of the ravages of pathogens without a lot of protections from biomedicine. So I felt that helped, but within an article, the word limit is always so strong, and it's always a question of, and then you send it out to review, and the reviewers, of course, always want, well, you should have also talked about this and that, and so you're trying to put more in, but you also have to take something out. And so I felt, there was a lot more richness and detail that we kind of couldn't get in. But there's wonderful work, especially by colleagues in anthropology who spent a lot of time in kind of ethnographic detail mapping out the experiences. And a lot of that material is publicly available. So I felt reassured by that.
Is there anything you would have done differently if you had to do this again?
I think there are two things. I think one is it would have been really nice to get the grant, but we didn't, and I feel that was really a lost opportunity. Of course, it was right before COVID, and maybe it would have been different if the context had been different. But I felt we had a really wonderful team of great colleagues that we got together. But that's not just my experience. That's many people have this experience. I think there are two other things that I would have liked to do different in retrospect. One is that the article is really quite a collective effort. So because it started off as a grant application, I have great colleagues at Sussex and around the world who give peer review and feedback before you submit the grant, so there was a long list of people who contributed, ideas and insights and literatures. And, even my wife was a great theorist, spent a lot of time talking to me and giving me inspiration for theoretical sources to look at. And so it's almost like a collective piece of writing, but somehow the authorship, and they're all acknowledged in the acknowledgements, but the authorship arrangements somehow don't quite do justice to that. So that's one thing. And the other thing is, I don't know if I would have done it differently, but I still have, there is a sense of unease around the article that doesn't go away, and that has to do with the kind of issues around positionality. So it's like, yet it's going to be another thing of, a white man in a high income country trying to speak for Indonesia and telling the story of the global South. And then he's even drawing on, intersectional methodologies that come from Black feminist thought. I was like, oh, this is just, there was a lot of wrestling with this. And in the end, I felt, look, the story is so important, and especially with COVID, and because the whole story was unfolding yet again during the COVID pandemic, I said, we on balance, we have to tell the story. But if I'm completely honest, that sense of unease has probably not disappeared completely. So, but I'm not yet sure how I would have done that differently. But yeah, that's my best answer to that question.
I get that. Actually, if I may very quickly kind of interject on that, I think the positionality thing maybe never goes away. I do research on the south of Angola, and I am from Angola. I was born in the south of Angola. And even I have this unease with doing research with marginalized people. And, on many accounts, I am the right person to do this, but I don't know, unease, guilt. Yeah, I'm just here to say that even someone who, by all accounts, I don't know, is less of a, what's the word? Usual suspect. Yeah, even someone that doesn't really fit the box of the usual suspect, this does not leave.
At least we can speak openly about it and acknowledge it.
No, that's true. That's absolutely true. Yeah. So there's a student who wants to work on this and comes to you. What advice do you have for him or her?
So first of all, I have huge awe for anybody who is entering kind of academia. I think it's become even more challenging than it was when I joined. So I have nothing but awe and respect for people who are entering. But I think the biggest thing that I've learned is I very much started as a kind of lone scholar model, and it was just kind of us and writing and researching, and that was when I started, quite a widespread pattern in international relations. And I felt the most advances and benefits have come from speaking across disciplines, speaking to many other scholars and colleagues. And so that would be my advice. Shop it around, present as often as you can, and you never get it right the first time. I never get it right the first time, but third or fourth time it gets better, and so then you can improve. And just please don't give up.
Absolutely, that's true. Is there anything you want to add before we go?
Oh, I'd like to say thank you for your interest in the work, and I hope maybe this will also help draw some attention to these important issues, which really haven't received that much attention in international relations in the past.
Thank you for tagging along to the second episode of IPS Behind the Research. We'll continue periodically releasing interviews with authors that have published on a variety of topics within the journal International Political Sociology. In the meantime, you can follow us on X at INTPOLITSOCIO. I hope you'll want to join me next time we look behind the research.